So, Gerson, it's 2011. News Corp is in the middle of this crisis in the UK, hacking into celebrity cell phones, hacking into the cell phone of this poor murdered 13-year-old girl. It's not just a compliance crisis, it's a political crisis, it's a public relations crisis. You get a phone call asking you to come join this company. Why'd you do it?
That's an easier question to answer than what I thought you were going to ask me, which is why would you sit for an interview with a Wall Street, with the Journal in the middle of all this?
I bet you didn't do it by cell phone, though.
Well, so there were a couple of things in play. The first is if you've spent 30 years trying cases, as I did, you are drawn to the opportunity as a lawyer to make a difference. And I saw a great company that wanted a lawyer to help manage their way through some challenges. I also met with some folks and I was really struck by the extent to which Rupert Murdoch, Chase Carey, senior managers were absolutely committed to doing whatever it took to not live through something like this again. And so it seemed to me that the folks there were, to borrow the overused adage of Rahm Emanuel, were looking at this crisis as an opportunity to make changes and put themselves in a position where it couldn't happen again. So I had the sense that there was both an opportunity for a lawyer and that the access and the authority and the resources would be available to get something done.
I want to read you what the parliamentary committee concluded, had not yet concluded at the time you took the job, but this was the conclusion of the parliamentary committee that looked into this, talked about a culture that permeated from the top throughout the organization and speaks volumes about the lack of effective corporate governance at News Corporation and News International. We conclude, therefore, that Rupert Murdoch is not a fit person to exercise the stewardship of a major international company.
Well, I'm happy to report that even commercial rivals of News Corp on their editorial pages found that conclusion, that assertion to be ridiculous. As you know, that was a sort of it's a tightly fought political battle between the members of that parliamentary committee. One group offering that conclusion, the other group ridiculing the conclusion, saying it undermined all their work. So I guess where I come from is essentially this.
So you don't buy that conclusion?
No, I don't buy that. That said, it's worth stepping back and looking at this. I mean, this is the rationale of my hire was step back, look at this, and figure out what we could do better.
Yeah,
and
so you step back and take a look at it. What was the problem as you diagnosed it? Okay. Talk about the problem first, and then we'll talk about what you did to deal with it.
Well, so there are here's what it wasn't. So it's not a culture, because empirically, we've looked all over the company. We've looked at newspapers in Australia, we've looked at newspapers in the United States, we've looked at business operations all over the world, and nothing like this happened anywhere except in the UK. So that's false. There are features of this that are local and unique and particular. So you had you had an arrest where the police gathered up all of this, all of the critical evidence from the principal operator who was engaged in this activity, didn't share it, didn't tell us about it, did their own investigation and said, we've got the people, it's this guy and a reporter. When a question was raised about whether or not that was right, local lawyers and local managers looked into it, did their own review, decided the police were right, and the only folks who were challenging that were people with a sort of high degree of political and commercial motivation to take shots. And so it's not a surprise that the company and the board thought that they had the problem understood and managed. So when I look at this, so when I look at this, that turns out to be wrong. So when I look at this, structurally through the genius of hindsight, I thought about this and thought, ironically, if you look at one of the company's great strengths, which is its sort of non-bureaucratic, highly decentralized, highly entrepreneurial culture, critical to the DNA. They don't follow conventional wisdom, and they don't have 45 committee meetings to decide what to buy and what to sell. They move much as Rupert did, on instinct, and quickly. And
dramatically different than, say, a Time Warner or another comparable media company which has much more of a central office.
A extraordinarily decentralized company. So while that may be, and has proven to be, a brilliant way to manage a business, in hindsight, there are aspects of that that are not ideal for managing legal risk, because the one thing that we've come to learn. The reason why you have symposiums like this, and you didn't have them 10 years ago, is that there are no purely local legal problems. At the end of the day, through the miracle of either federal statutes or plaintiffs' lawyers or security suits, you're going to be held accountable for what goes on all over the world. So if I'm going to be blamed, I might as well help manage it from the start. And so my thought was, while it's understandable that they had local lawyers and local managers investigate the problem, it's not the sure way to go, not now, not in this environment. And so one thing I recommended, and the board endorsed, was that if anything comes up that goes to sort of the fundamental integrity of the business anywhere in the world, it gets escalated. Gets escalated to my office and the people who work with me, and we decide how that gets investigated. Do we bring outside resources to bear? Do we put the managers in place to a side and have other folks carry the laboring oar? And that way, we assure ourselves, sort of at the mothership, that if there is something going on anywhere in the world that goes to issues of fundamental integrity, as I said, if you're going to get blamed, you might as well take responsibility for it early.
That sounds very simple and very sensible. Fundamental issue. If it goes to the integrity of the company, it has to be escalated. But how hard is it to actually make that happen in a decentralized global company like this?
Well, the reality is you meet two kinds of perspectives. So the lawyers, who are all like me, risk averse, and this is why we went to law school and didn't do something productive. The lawyers tend to be enthusiastic about the idea that if there is an issue emerging in their business, having help and reporting it up and sharing it and being required to, so that we can look at it. The issue becomes when you go beyond the simple question, as you put it, an issue going to integrity, and you turn to, well, what about the whole range of controls? What about, cash controls, how you do due diligence, how you admit a new third party to pay them, all of the whole menu of internal controls. Are you going to sort of launch all of those from Olympus?
Kick everything upstairs.
Are you going to kick everything upstairs? And so at the end, you can say, like the surgeon, I did a fantastic operation, the patient died. You don't want that. You don't want to destroy what makes the company great. You don't want to take that. So you need to confront, if you're going to do this at a company like News Corp, you need to find a compliance strategy that takes into account the decentralized nature of the business.
Yeah, and let's talk about that a little bit, because it's not, as you say, the DNA that made News Corp great, it's not just decentralization, it's also a certain tolerance for risk. and yet you're in a position where you're trying to reduce risk, and there's some risk obviously that's good and some risk that's bad. But how do you do this without making the culture increasingly risk averse and losing a lot of what made the company great?
I think what we've settled on, and this is just through being there, is a sort of a mix of strategies. It's not all, Soviet central planning, and it's not all, let the thousand flowers bloom. It's a mix, and so for something that goes to fundamental integrity, that just has to be escalated, and we have to control the investigation and the look. History tells us that is the only way to manage problems like that, period. But then when you get into the whole nest of compliance controls, which can be very intrusive, I think what we've settled on is something that goes like this. There are certain policies, there are certain broad principles that you're expected to follow in various parts of the business. And those policies we've studied and we've strengthened and we've promulgated and disseminated through the company in a central manner. But when it comes to the actual implementation of the policies, I have tried to do that in a manner that's very customized and very localized. And so, you may be doing business in a part of the world that on the risk index is all red. So it's, following an orthodox formula, you would beef up and heavy up all your bureaucracy and controls there. But if you actually go down to that company and you sit down with those folks and you find out, what do you buy, what do you sell, how do you do business, you may find out, as I have in certain corners of the News Corp world, that actually it's an extraordinarily low-risk business from a compliance perspective. Maybe all kinds of business risks, which I'm not in the business of deciding on. But the legal risk on it may actually be, contrary to what you'd expect, relatively narrow and finite because of the nature of the business. So alternatively, as we've seen, you could be in the United Kingdom, which is normally thought of as a country with low compliance risk and a low corruption risk, where you could have issues. And so what I've tried to do, and the people working with me have tried to do, is actually go, put the boots on the ground, go to the individual companies, sit down with them, understand actually how the business works, go through in detail every interaction that there is with government at every level, from buying to licensing to permitting to selling to advertising, everything, and see where is it that there is some risk, some motivation on the edges. And that's where you put your energy, and that's where you spend your money. And that has two advantages. First, it's actually more efficacious. It actually works better from a pure compliance perspective to do this, implement on a localized basis. And second, of course, it's a much easier sell politically. And so if you are sitting in New York, it is one thing to sort of attempt or purport to write a script for how a business should be run in India. It just on its face will have a tendency to rub a businessman the wrong way. If you go and sit down with him and you learn exactly how his business operates, and he can show you how it operates, and you can show him where his risk points are, it's much more acceptable for them to take on, if any added controls are needed, for him to see why that makes sense for him, why that's good for him as well as being good for me.
A question about that, because the extraordinary thing about this scandal, crisis, whatever you want to call it, at News Corp was it wasn't just a legal and compliance issue. It very quickly became a public relations issue. You had competitors of the paper. I mean, I was over in London when this first broke, and the Guardian had 7 full pages of coverage. I think there were some soldiers, UK soldiers, who died in Iraq the day before, and that was pushed to page 8, so they could devote the first 7 pages of the newspaper to attacking News Corporation. You had political political critics, political rivals who were clearly using this from the beginning to go after it. So how do you, sitting in your legal compliance chair, how do you deal with those huge public relations and political issues? You never know where that's going to come from.
Actually, you can count on it coming. And you know, the only thing you're not going to change history. You're not going to change the fact that, in the eyes of some, you know, the sort of breaking of the print union in the early 80s was an unforgivable sin, or the backing Tony Blair and diffusing, you know, a certain political movement was unforgivable. You're not going to change that. I'm not sure I'd want to. All you can do as a lawyer when you arrive, when I did, is say, you know, what are the features of this that we can control and we can improve? So, obviously, one feature which was in place before I got there is the underlying conduct, the underlying behavior has to stop, and you know, you can't be using investigators for those purposes. You have to have policies in place that ensure that people can't do it. You have to have better controls over cash or payments. All of that was actually underway before I got there in London. But what I think what you have to recognize is when you're at a large company with 46,000 employees is the response has to be, you need to work on the response, because it becomes a political and commercial weapon when you, in part, when your response isn't as robust as it could have been. And you know, in hindsight, although the police were telling them it was one or two, it was the one reporter, although their local lawyer's investigation told them that. It doesn't matter. If it turns out to be wrong, it's not good.
Yeah.
So what you need to do is say to yourself, I can't have that happen again. This was what I was told when I was hired. I don't ever want to see this again. And what can you do? Well, one thing you can do is when there is a hint of anything, you need to get in, bring the best resources to bear, dig it out and fix it. That's I think, all you can. You're not going to get rid of the fact that you have you know, political and commercial rivals who are eager to see you fail. All you can do is give them less to work with.